before empires learned to name themselves, before ships carried flags or laws across water, there was only the sea. It stretched outward without edge or intention, a vast, breathing surface beneath the slow turning of the sky. Waves rose and fell in patient repetition, not crashing, not resting, simply moving. The sound was constant and low, like a long exhale that never fully ended. Along the shore, water met land again and again, wearing stone smooth over centuries no one counted. The sea did not hurry. Morning arrived softly here. Light slid across the water in pale bands, silver and blue, shifting with every small movement of the surface. The sun did not strike the ocean all at once. It unfolded gradually, revealing ripples, then swells, then the deeper color beneath. The air smelled of salt and dampness, sharp but clean, filling the lungs and lingering there. Early humans stood at this edge. They did not rush forward. They stood still, feet pressed into wet sand, watching. The water reached for them, then withdrew, reached again. Each wave erased what came before it, footprints, markings, signs of presence, leaving the shore smooth and quiet once more. This was the first lesson the sea offered. Nothing here lasted unless it learned how to move. Behind them, land felt solid, trees stood rooted, stones stayed where they were placed. Paths once walked remained visible, but the sea erased certainty. It accepted nothing fixed, nothing rigid. To enter it meant to accept change without resistance. The people listened. They listened to the rhythm of the waves, noticing how it shifted with wind. They noticed how water darkened when clouds gathered, how its surface tightened before storms. Birds skimmed low across it, sometimes dipping suddenly, sometimes retreating inland without warning. These signs were quiet, but they mattered. Children crouched near tide pools, watching small creatures cling to rock, holding fast against the pull of water. They learned that survival here meant attachment without stiffness, gripping firmly, but letting the water pass. Adults watched farther out. They watched driftwood move with the current, turning slowly, never sinking. They watched floating leaves travel farther than expected, carried beyond sight. These small observations settled into memory, unspoken but persistent. Time passed without urgency. Tides came and went. The shoreline changed shape subtly from day to day. Rocks that were dry one morning lay submerged the next. The sea claimed and released land without apology. And slowly, curiosity grew. Not the sharp curiosity of conquest, but the quiet kind, the kind that asks without demanding answers. What lay beyond the horizon? What carried the birds so far from shore? What supported the floating wood, allowing it to ride the water instead of disappearing beneath it? The first interactions were cautious. People waded only as far as their knees, then their waists. Cold bit into skin, numbing at first, then awakening nerves sharply. The pull of water surprised them, tugging at legs with more strength than expected. Balance became uncertain. Movement required attention. Those who stayed too long learned quickly. The sea did not punish recklessness loudly. It simply continued moving. At night, the ocean changed its voice. Waves sounded deeper, heavier. Darkness hid distance. The horizon vanished completely, leaving only the sound of water moving endlessly. The moon painted a trembling path across the surface, light breaking apart with each ripple. People gathered near small fires on the beach, watching that light. It felt like a road, but one that could not be walked. Stars appeared overhead, clearer near the coast than inland, reflected faintly on the water's surface. The sky and sea began to feel connected, mirrors of one another. Movement above echoed movement below. This connection lingered in the mind. Seasons passed. In warmer months, the sea felt gentler, its surface calmer, inviting closer approach. In colder seasons, it darkened and grew rougher, waves stacking upon waves, wind tearing foam from their tops. The people learned when to stay back, when to observe from a distance. Observation became habit. Certain stones near the shore were always wet, others dried quickly. Shells gathered in predictable places after storms. Seaweed appeared and vanished with tides. These patterns formed a quiet map, one that did not need drawing. Gradually, the idea formed that the sea was not empty. It was full of movement, of pathways, of invisible systems repeating endlessly. What looked like chaos revealed structure to those who waited long enough. The earliest attempts to touch the water more deeply were tentative. A log pushed into shallow surf, a bundle of reeds tied together loosely. These objects floated, sometimes briefly, sometimes long enough to carry weight. People tested them carefully, pressing down with hands, watching how water resisted without breaking. Buoyancy was not understood as a concept. It was felt. The sensation of weight supported by water lingered in the body, surprising and reassuring at once. Something solid could exist on this moving surface. Something could ride it. Fear did not vanish, but it softened. The sea was no longer just an edge. It became a possibility. Still, no one ventured far. The shoreline remained a boundary, respected, studied, never rushed. Those who lived closest to it learned its moods best. They knew when fog crept in suddenly, swallowing sound and distance. They knew when currents tugged harder in one direction than another. They spoke of these things quietly, in gestures more than words. Long before the idea of an empire, before trade or power or dominance, there was relationship. A relationship built on patience. The sea did not respond to force. It responded to understanding. Those who moved with it lasted longer. Those who resisted grew tired quickly. At dawn, the surface often lay smooth, reflecting sky so clearly it felt like standing between two worlds. At dusk, colors deepened, blues, purples, blacks, until water and sky merged into one continuous darkness. Standing at the shore during these moments felt grounding. Small, comfortingly small. The sea reminded those who watched it that scale mattered, that human concerns were brief compared to tides, that ambition dissolved quickly in salt and motion. And yet something enduring was taking shape. A way of thinking shaped by water rather than land, a patience tuned to rhythm rather than speed, an acceptance that movement itself could be a home. This was the quiet beginning. Before ships, before routes, before forgotten empires. Just water breathing against land and people learning, slowly to listen. The first boats were not vessels of conquest. They were simple, fragile experiments, stitched together from wood, reeds, or hollowed logs. Each was heavy in hand before it ever touched the water, solid yet strangely light when lifted, a promise of possibility rather than mastery. Early builders ran their fingers along the grain of the timber, smelling resin and sap, noticing every knot, every small imperfection. Each imperfection demanded attention. Each imperfection told a story of the tree, its years of sunlight, its survival against wind and frost. The shore became a workshop. Sand was pressed under feet to create a stable platform. Small fires nearby softened pitch or tar, the scent thick and pungent, clinging to clothes and hair. Tools were primitive, stones carefully selected to split wood, shells sharpened to scrape and smooth. Every motion was deliberate, slow, because the sea demanded patience even before they entered it. The first boats touched water with caution. No one leapt in. Hands guided the hull, feeling it float, tilt, rock slightly, then settle. Fingers pressed against timber to sense its buoyancy. Water licked the wood gently, climbing slightly over the sides, retreating and returning, a rhythmic dance that mirrored the waves themselves. There was fear in this early voyage, a trembling knowledge that the boundary between land and sea had been crossed, and there was no turning back until return was chosen. Movement was deliberate. Even pushing the boat a few feet into deeper water required balance, awareness, and a steady rhythm. Legs shifted carefully. Bodies leaned slightly to counter the rocking. Each breath was mindful, taken to steady nerves, to remind oneself of presence and motion. Eyes scanned the horizon, noticing how light played across ripples, how foam formed at crests, how currents subtly nudged the vessel sideways. The first voyages were brief. They rarely lasted beyond the reach of familiar landmarks. Often, a single paddle stroke forward was followed by a cautious pause. Water surrounded on all sides, quiet except for gentle lap and distant calls of seabirds. Small fish darted underneath, reflected in the glint of sunlight. The smell of salt was sharp but invigorating, lingering on skin, mixing with smoke from fires left behind on the shore. Children watched with fascination. Some were allowed near the edge, toes digging into wet sand, hands brushing against floating hulls. They learned through touch by observing adults' movements, how to test balance, how to feel weight distribution, how to sense water's response to a shift in posture. Observation became instruction, silent and patient. The first small crossings revealed lessons about the ocean's temperament. Currents moved subtly, tugging at the hull. Wind pushed lightly or more insistently. The first sailors learned that forward motion required coordination, not force. They learned to read the water as they had read the sky, through careful attention to detail, repetition, and reflection. Every journey, even the briefest, was an experiment in trust. The smell of wet wood mixed with salt and tar became familiar. Hands grew calloused. Fingers stiffened slightly from holding paddles, pushing against oars, gripping edges of timber. Even minor discomforts were remembered, adjusted for, learned from. Repetition taught endurance. Each morning began with inspection of boats, each seam, each stitch, each small patch of repair. Neglect could mean tipping, water filling the hull, or a sudden spill that reminded one of mortality. The horizon remained distant but inviting. Each movement outward felt like a promise and a question. What lay beyond familiar shores? What could be reached if patience and observation continued? The first boats carried hope slowly, gently. Movement was not hurried. Each advance was measured, deliberate, respectful of water's rhythm. At night, fires burned near the shore. They illuminated half-built hulls, tools arranged carefully, and shadows flickering across sand. The smell of smoke, salt, and damp wood mingled with the sound of waves. The rhythmic lapping seemed to harmonize with the quiet crackle of fire. Observers noticed patterns in foam, subtle shifts in water movement under moonlight, reflections of stars dancing along gentle swells. Even brief exposures to water taught reflection. Humans learned to wait, to observe, to synchronize with rhythm rather than resist it. Lessons of patience, balance, and humility emerged naturally, shaping thoughts as much as bodies. With the passage of seasons, boats improved slowly. New shapes were tried, keels carved deeper to track currents, hulls widened slightly for stability, bindings learned to hold against the pull of wind and waves. Each innovation came from experience, not instruction. Mistakes were observed, repeated, corrected, slowly embedding knowledge in memory, muscle, and breath. By the time the first generations fully trusted their vessels, the sea felt different. No longer only a boundary, no longer only an unknown. It was now a medium, a companion. Its rhythm could be read, respected, and followed. Each paddle stroke, each careful push, each slight tilt of body against motion was both dialogue and practice. The first crossings were quiet. They did not carry names or flags, empires or armies. They carried curiosity, patience, and the slow accumulation of skill. Boats moved like whispers across silent water, leaving almost no trace but a ripple, a faint disturbance that vanished as quickly as it came. The sea had been crossed slowly. Not conquered, not claimed, but known. And in that knowledge, the first seeds of maritime empires were planted. The early sailors quickly discovered that the sea spoke in a language of subtle signs, patterns, and moods, a language that could not be read in haste. Every day offered lessons, not written in ink but felt in the bones, in the weight of water against hull, in the tug of wind on skin. The rhythm of waves became a guide, a constant companion, as vital as breath itself. Morning light stretched slowly across the horizon. The water reflected it like molten glass, quivering slightly with each ripple. Sailors pushed their small craft into the rising tide, noting how currents bent their path, how water flowed past submerged stones, and how even the smallest wind could turn the hull if not met with careful balance. They learned to adjust paddle angles, shift weight, and anticipate the sea's quiet resistance. The wind was not merely air in motion. It was a messenger, a guide. Its direction, its consistency, its whispers in the rigging, all carried information about the distance to land, the likelihood of storms, and the currents beneath. Sailors began to notice clouds forming offshore, the sudden appearance of certain birds, the temperature of air and water. Each subtle cue became part of a mental map, a silent dialogue between human and ocean. Hands grasped ropes worn smooth by repeated friction. Fingers memorized knots, tension, and release. The creak of wood bending with water became familiar, a sound that required no translation, yet spoke volumes. Every boat vibrated differently. Every paddle stroke left a trace that echoed in balance and rhythm. The body itself became an instrument, learning to predict, adjust, and harmonize with movement beyond its control. Observation demanded patience. The first storms were not dramatic tales of heroism. They were quiet tests, a sudden gust turning a small craft, waves stacking slightly higher than expected, gray clouds drifting lower. Sailors learned not to fight but to wait, to read patterns, to adjust. Calmness became survival. Panic was self-defeating. Awareness and reflection were rewarded by smooth passage, failure by capsizing or exhaustion. Over weeks, a language of motion emerged. Sails could be tilted to catch shifting winds. Paddles could skim lightly over the surface to maintain stability. Slight shifts in weight could prevent tipping. Eyes scanned horizons constantly, reading light, shadow, and movement. Feet and legs adjusted instinctively, learned through repetition, aligning with the pulse of water. Bodies and minds synchronized. Even silence became instructive. Morning and evening brought different tones in water and wind. Dawn offered calm, mirrored skies, soft breezes that encouraged cautious exploration. Dusk brought shadows, cooling air, and reflections that stretched distance into abstraction. Listening was as important as watching. Subtle differences in wave pressure against hull told the story of hidden currents, of unseen shoals, of gentle pushes and pulls. The sea carried more than water. It carried signs of life. Schools of fish moving in unison beneath the surface, their shapes reflecting pale sunlight. Birds diving and rising, tracing invisible paths. Floating vegetation, slowly turning and twisting with drift. Each carried information, a signal that humans learn to interpret slowly, without force, without haste. Long voyages were begun in small increments. A day on calm water might extend a few meters farther than before. A night under stars, paddling silently, allowed the sailors to memorize constellations, positions over the horizon. They discovered that movement and reflection were inseparable. To row was to think, to balance was to watch, to survive was to understand. The ocean demanded respect. It offered passage only to those willing to pay attention. Ignorance was visible in the bending hull, in wet timber that shifted unexpectedly, in every misjudged wave. Knowledge was acquired not by daring, but by observation, patience, and repetition. Mistakes were remembered, not for blame, but as lessons encoded into muscles, breath, and mind. The rhythm of the tide became a measure of time. Ebb and flow marked days. Spring and neap tides shaped schedules. Storms arrived in predictable cycles. The moon's pull was felt, not calculated, in the way water moved, how currents thickened, how fish gathered. Sailors observed these subtle changes, knotting patterns over months and seasons, understanding long before words could describe. The first long passages were almost meditative. Hands on oars, eyes tracing horizon, ears listening to creaking wood and water lapping, sailors felt a merging with the sea. Fear remained, but so did wonder. Small successes, reaching a familiar cove, finding calm water, reading a distant wind correctly, were celebrated quietly in relief, in a slight smile, in the deep breath that followed effort. Over time, confidence grew. Not as arrogance, but as deep understanding. Sailors knew that progress was gradual, that mastery was never final. They learned that water had memory, where currents converged, where winds shifted, where waves consistently followed patterns. This knowledge became part of daily thought, a mental map as real as any physical landmark, yet constantly shifting. Even mundane tasks were full of meaning. Adjusting a sail, shifting weight, checking the hull, each act became a conversation with the elements. Each repetition reinforced awareness, patience, and humility. Every successful maneuver strengthened the quiet bond between human and ocean, a bond that would one day form the foundation of maritime empires. By the time the first routes between coasts became reliable, sailors carried more than goods, they carried understanding. They carried the language of wind, the dialogue of currents, the memory of tides. Every ripple, gust, and drifted leaf was interpreted, remembered, and repeated. The sea had begun to speak, and humans had begun to listen. The first gatherings along the shore were quiet and deliberate, small clusters of huts, fires, and storage pits, built where waves receded and tides offered gentle retreat. Early communities were drawn to the edges of water not for conquest or glory, but for survival and connection. They watched the same skis, felt the same winds, and shared in the subtle lessons offered by currents and tides. Boats, once fragile experiments, became tools of exchange. The first crossings between neighboring coasts were brief and intentional, carrying only essential goods, dried fish, woven reeds, shells, and simple tools. Movement was careful, measured, and steeped in reflection. Each journey became a map etched into memory, currents, depths, and subtle signs of land visible before it could be seen fully. Harbors were natural and humble. A small indentation in rock, a sandy crescent, or a calm cove became a place to moor boats and share goods. People learned to notice subtle shifts in tides, rocks barely visible beneath the surface, and underwater currents that could tug unexpectedly. Every detail was recorded, not in ink, but in the body and mind, forming the first tacit maps of early maritime routes. Communication between settlements was often silent or minimal. A wave of a hand, the lighting of a small signal fire, or the careful placement of an object in the sand conveyed messages. Trade was rhythmic and repetitive, occurring on predictable days when tides were favorable. These patterns created a sense of order and continuity, allowing people to move between communities safely and with purpose. Small exchanges carried more than goods. Stories traveled along with items, whispered observations of distant shores, the peculiar behavior of birds, or changes in currents. The transfer of knowledge became as vital as the transfer of material objects. Observers learned to watch others' methods, imitating carefully while adjusting to local conditions. Skills were acquired gradually, absorbed through observation and repeated practice, never forced or hurried. The rhythm of daily life followed the tides and seasons. Boats were cared for meticulously, paddles dried and oiled, hulls inspected for cracks, tar and pitch applied with patience. Meals were simple, often shared among travelers and hosts, blending the flavors of local herbs, salted fish, and roasted grains. Each act, no matter how mundane, reinforced awareness of the environment and respect for the sea. Nightfall brought another layer of learning. Stars reflected on the water's surface, guiding the eye and mind toward distant points of land. Moonlight illuminated subtle movements in waves, revealing hidden rocks and currents. The quiet lapping of water against the shore became a lullaby, teaching sailors the stillness and attentiveness needed to navigate successfully. Observing the heavens and the sea simultaneously created a dual map of the environment, one of movement and one of reflection. Over months and years, certain paths became established. Repeated crossings taught patterns of tide and current, of winds that carried boats faster or slowed progress. Seasonal changes dictated the rhythm of voyages. Calmer months allowed longer journeys, while storm-prone seasons demanded caution. Sailors learned to anticipate not just the sea's behavior, but the behavior of those traveling alongside it, developing a network of knowledge that stretched across distances gradually. Even small delays held lessons. A boat caught in a slow current or held at bay by an unexpected wind offered time for reflection. Travelers observed marine life, weather patterns, and the subtle shifts in shoreline shape. These moments, though frustrating, became critical points of learning, reinforcing patience and attentiveness. The sea taught that success required observation as much as movement. These early coastal networks were intimate. Relationships between communities were maintained through trust, shared knowledge, and predictable exchange. One small gesture, a carefully placed trade item, a repeated signal, or a shared observation, could strengthen connections that spanned miles of water. Each crossing reinforced social cohesion, making survival and continuity possible in a world shaped by tides and currents. Boats themselves became symbols of connection. They were extensions of the body, tools of communication, and repositories of shared experience. The act of navigating between coasts was not merely physical, but intellectual and emotional. Sailors carried memory, technique, and reflection in every motion, connecting one human settlement to another silently and steadily. Through repetition, observation, and careful attention, early communities began to see the sea not as a barrier, but as a network of possibilities. Each cove, inlet, and channel held potential routes, each crossing a lesson in patience and navigation. Trade became habitual, predictable, and secure, fostering trust and interdependence. The first maps existed only in the mind and body, encoded through repetition and reflection. Observing water patterns, shifts in wind, and behaviors of birds and fish became as vital as any physical map. Knowledge traveled quietly, imperceptibly, laying the foundation for more organized, extensive maritime networks that would one day evolve into empires. At dawn, when fires glimmered along small coves and boats floated gently in shallow water, the rhythm of these networks was visible in motion. Paddles dipping slowly, small vessels drifting with current, hands adjusting sails with care. Even without names or titles, a system had emerged, a delicate, intricate web of knowledge, trust, and silent guidance. By evening, after goods had been exchanged and stories shared, the shore returned to calm. Waves lapped gently against hulls. Smoke from evening fires mingled with salt and wet wood. The sea remained constant, patient, teaching those who watched how to move, how to wait, and how to connect across distance. These quiet networks, invisible in many ways, would form the blueprint for future maritime power. The earliest routes, humble and unmarked, became arteries of human connection, knowledge, and survival. Through attentive observation and repeated movement, early sailors learned to interpret signs from the sea and each other. The foundation of maritime empires was thus laid, not in conquest or ceremony, but in quiet, deliberate practice, carried on small boats over calm and restless water alike. As decades passed, some coastal communities began to move beyond mere survival and exchange. They discovered that influence could be carried not in armies or walls, but in the quiet mastery of the sea. The water itself became their domain, a medium through which authority could be expressed gently yet unmistakably. The power of these early maritime peoples was subtle, reliant on knowledge, skill, and the patience of observation rather than brute force. Morning light revealed a harbor lined with small vessels. Each boat floated calmly, tied with ropes that had been tended daily, polished and oiled to prevent wear. The smell of salt and tar mingled with the aroma of roasting grains and fish. Sailors moved slowly, deliberately, adjusting sails, inspecting hulls, whispering instructions to apprentices. Every motion was purposeful, yet calm, a rhythm that mirrored the tides themselves. Trade became a tool of influence. Sailors offered safe passage through channels and estuaries known only to them, carrying goods from distant coasts. Rare shells, dried fish, carved tools, and woven mats were exchanged in return for provisions, information, or simple gratitude. These exchanges were not forceful. There were no tariffs enforced with threats, no swords raised to demand compliance. Influence traveled through reliability and expertise, quietly compelling respect. The rise of power was marked by repetition. Those who knew currents, wind patterns, and safe routes were sought after. Villagers relied on these sea masters to navigate waters that others dared not cross. Trust became currency, silently accruing in the form of reputation. Knowledge of tides, hidden shoals, and safe harbors conferred authority. Those who could read waves and stars were, in effect, leaders. Boats became extensions of the body. Sailors moved with them as if breathing, feeling every push and pull of water beneath their vessels. Fingers traced rope knots and wood seams, anticipating subtle shifts before they occurred. Even the tilt of a hull was read like a heartbeat, informing each decision. To the untrained eye, these movements appeared simple, almost meditative. But each adjustment was part of an intricate dialogue with nature, a conversation that few could understand, yet all respected. The rhythm of daily life reinforced control. Boats were repaired meticulously. Nets were mended, supplies stored carefully. Routines were simple but exacting, designed to keep vessels ready for any conditions. Fires burned low in the early hours, filling the air with smoke that mingled with salt and wet wood. The constant repetition of these acts reinforced skill, reliability, and presence. Observing the horizon became a habit. Sailors noted cloud formations, wind direction, and wave patterns, sometimes days in advance. They measured the sun's angle at dawn and dusk, tracking the slow migration of stars across the night sky. They noticed which birds lingered near certain coasts, which fish appeared where currents met, and how tides changed with lunar cycles. This careful attention allowed them to predict conditions and control movement more effectively than any force of arms could. Power was often expressed in silence. A fleet arriving at a foreign harbor carried no banners, no noise, no threat, yet the presence alone commanded attention. Traders and villagers recognized expertise in navigation, understanding that those who mastered the sea held the keys to prosperity and survival. Respect was earned through demonstration of skill and reliability, a quiet authority that persisted without spectacle. Even within their own communities, influence was subtle. Knowledge of tides and currents, the art of maintaining vessels, and the ability to predict weather conferred status. Elders guided apprentices slowly, passing on observations accumulated over years. Lessons were imparted through example rather than instruction, repetition rather than lecture. Young sailors learned that mastery was built in patience, endurance, and observation. Voyages began to expand in distance. Coastal paths were now linked by predictable routes, and traders and sailors carried goods over stretches of sea previously thought too dangerous. Each successful passage reinforced authority. Those who navigated through storms, avoided hidden shoals, and returned safely with cargo were celebrated quietly. Their reputation spread to neighboring harbors, drawing respect without aggression. By evening, the harbor settled into calm. Boats floated gently, ropes coiled with care, and fires burned low. Sailors rested, listening to the rhythm of the waves, contemplating wind patterns, or tracing the memory of currents in their minds. The quiet repetition of these routines reinforced skill and reliability, consolidating influence through consistency rather than force. The silent maritime power extended beyond trade. Knowledge itself became a protective barrier. Those unfamiliar with shifting currents or hidden reefs dared not navigate alone. Control of information, of routes, seasons, and safe passages, was as vital as control of vessels. Through observation and patience, These early maritime communities governed the flow of movement across water, shaping human activity without raising a sword. Even at night, under a sky mirrored on the calm sea, influence persisted. Small lanterns bobbed on water, faintly illuminating quiet faces. Waves lapped gently against hulls, carrying whispers of distant coasts. Knowledge of the sea and its moods was power, subtle yet enduring, rooted in observation, patience, and practice. Those who held this knowledge shaped the movement of people and goods across silent waters. Their authority felt rather than spoken, their presence respected rather than enforced. These early maritime empires did not claim lands far inland. Their dominion lay in fluidity, in rhythm, in the understanding that influence could travel silently across water. Power was measured not by territory, but by the ability to move, connect, and sustain life along coasts and across channels. And in this gentle mastery of the ocean, they set the foundation for an enduring, quiet empire, one built not on conquest, but on observation, trust, and the subtle guidance of tides. The sea became not only a highway of power and trade, but also a home. Boats were no longer merely vessels to cross water. They were spaces where life unfolded in slow rhythm, where survival, reflection, and daily routines intertwined. Each plank, each rope, each small cabin or deck space was designed to accommodate the subtle, constant motion of the water beneath. Sailors learned to inhabit their vessels as extensions of their own bodies, moving, eating, sleeping, and thinking with the tides. Morning light spilled across the deck in muted gold, illuminating coiled ropes, patches of worn wood, and small fires still smoldering from early preparation. The smell of salt and resin mingled with the lingering aroma of porridge and roasted fish, the morning meal carefully consumed while the boat rocked gently with the rhythm of the tide. Movements were deliberate. One hand adjusted the sail, another tended the small cooking fire, a foot shifted to counterbalance the tilt of the hull. Even simple acts demanded awareness, attuned to the motion beneath them. Life aboard required constant attentiveness. Hammocks swayed slightly with each wave, nets hung loosely to dry in the sun, and tools were carefully stowed to prevent sliding or falling. The sensation of movement became second nature, the lapping of water against the hull a gentle vibration beneath the body, a lullaby for those who rested, and a warning for those active on deck. Sleep itself was rhythmic, one eye often open, attuned to creaking timbers, shifting wind, or distant bird calls. The vessel was alive, and the humans aboard were part of its slow pulse. Daily routines mirrored the slow flow of the sea. Repairs were undertaken with patience, from mending torn sails to smoothing splintered planks. Each knot tied, each seam caulked became an act of care and meditation. Meals were prepared with deliberate packing, ingredients stored carefully, fires tended with vigilance. No action was rushed. Even the simplest task, rolling a rope, scrubbing a deck, checking provisions, was infused with awareness, a reflection of life intertwined with water. Movement and balance became intimate arts. Walking across the deck required attention to tilt, timing with swells, and an understanding of the hull's response. Hands braced against posts, ropes, or railing as the boat heaved gently beneath them. Eyes scanned the horizon constantly, noting wind direction, approaching clouds and distant currents. Each adjustment was measured, reinforcing a deep, unspoken conversation between human and vessel. Meals themselves were sensory experiences. Salted fish released their briny aroma, mingling with the faint smoke of cooking fires. Grain porridge, prepared slowly over embers, carried warmth and sustenance in hands that felt the gentle rocking beneath. Even the taste of water from the casks seemed imbued with motion, an echo of the waves outside. Eating was never separate from movement. Every act reminded sailors that life was inseparable from the water surrounding them. The vessel shaped relationships aboard. Small cabins or open decks became spaces of observation and reflection. Conversations were quiet, punctuated by the sound of wind in sails or the slap of water against the hull. Apprentices observed elders' careful movements, learning not just practical skills but a rhythm of life tuned to patience and awareness. Each day, knowledge was passed silently through demonstration, tying knots, adjusting sails, balancing with swells, observing weather patterns. Experience was encoded in body and mind, repeated and refined over time. Even rituals took place aboard. Before departures, sailors often paused to cast offerings into the sea, small tokens of respect, prayers, or gestures of gratitude. The water received them silently, carrying away intentions into currents and distance. The motions of these acts were deliberate, hands extended, eyes lowered, breath synchronized with waves. The repetition of these rituals grounded the sailors, reminding them that life at sea required humility and mindfulness. Traveling longer distances emphasized the vessel as a living space. Supplies were stored efficiently: barrels of food, casks of water, bundles of rope. Every item had a place, each carefully balanced to prevent shifting with the boat's motion. Movements were choreographed unconsciously, shifting weight to compensate, passing tools along without abrupt force, adjusting sails in concert with the rhythm of waves. The deck itself became a stage of interdependent action, a living organism guided by skill and observation. Even leisure was infused with awareness. Sailors observed the slow passage of clouds, the reflection of stars on water at night, the glint of fish beneath the surface. Reading the subtle signs of weather became entertainment and survival simultaneously. The sea offered lessons continually, whether in calm dawn or stormy evening, and those aboard remained students of its unending curriculum. The night brought another dimension to living aboard. Stars reflected faintly on gentle swells, lanterns flickered softly across decks, and the quiet hum of water against timber created a lullaby for those awake. Sleep was intertwined with alertness, the body attuned to movement instinctively. Dreams merged with memory of currents, sails, and wind. Even in rest, the vessel's rhythm shaped life, consciousness, and reflection. Through all this, a quiet bond formed between sailor and ship. Each day reinforced awareness, patience, and resilience. Every action, from tending fires to mending sails, became a meditation on living in harmony with motion. The vessel was not just a tool, it was home, mentor, and constant companion. Life at sea was measured in rhythm, in small movements repeated over and over, and in the attentive observation that shaped survival and understanding. By sunrise on another calm morning, sailors awoke to the gentle rocking of their floating home. Fires were stoked, ropes coiled, sails adjusted. The smell of salt and resin filled the air. Hands, feet, and eyes moved in unison with the vessel, echoing the slow, deliberate flow of the sea itself. Life had become both quiet and expansive, anchored in rhythm and reflection, preparing them for journeys that would extend far beyond the horizon. The first true maritime communities had emerged, not through force or conquest, but through inhabiting vessels as living spaces, through patience, observation, and the continuous, gentle dialogue between human and water. And within these floating homes, the foundation of empires, silent, observant, enduring, was slowly, imperceptibly laid. The rise of consistent wind patterns brought new possibilities to those who had long studied the sea. Sailors discovered that with careful observation and timing, they could travel farther than ever before, venturing beyond familiar coasts, guided by the gentle push of wind and the steady drift of currents. The world of water expanded, slowly revealing distant shores, islands hidden beyond the horizon, and new channels of trade and exchange. Morning light spilled across rippling water, soft and silvery, reflecting clouds that moved lazily with the breeze. Sailors prepared their vessels with deliberate care, checking sails, ropes, and oars. The scent of salt and wet timber mingled with tar and resin, grounding them in the tactile familiarity of their craft. Each movement was measured, each adjustment an act of dialogue with both vessel and elements. The wind carried the promise of distance, but also demanded attention, patience, and skill. The first long passages were tentative. Sailors extended their journey slowly, guided by the knowledge embedded in their bodies from years of observing currents and tides. Paddles and sails responded to subtle changes in air and water. A shift in gust required a tilt of the hull, a repositioning of weight, a delicate balancing act. Every action reinforced the ongoing conversation between human and sea, a dialogue that taught endurance, humility, and awareness. At night, the sea transformed. Stars reflected on the gentle swell, creating illusions of constellations doubled in water. Sailors learned to navigate by these reflections, tracking familiar star patterns as they mirrored the movements of the waves. The quiet lapping of water against the hull and the distant calls of nocturnal birds offered guidance as much as landmarks, anchoring sailors in a rhythm of observation and reflection. Trade winds themselves became guides, invisible paths across open water. They carried vessels steadily, gently nudging them toward coasts far beyond daily experience. Knowledge of seasonal shifts, wind direction, and the behavior of clouds was essential. Sailors who mastered these patterns could plan longer voyages, trusting in the predictable rhythm of air and tide rather than attempting to overpower the elements. Each journey became both practical and contemplative, teaching patience through deliberate packing. Floating over deep water, sailors encountered new forms of life. Schools of fish moved in precise formations, their silver scales catching sunlight. Birds circled above, their flight patterns indicating the proximity of land or currents. Occasionally, floating vegetation drifted by, providing clues to distant shores or currents. Every small observation contributed to an expanding mental map of the open sea, one encoded in memory, rhythm, and practice rather than in written maps or charts. The vessels themselves demanded constant attention. Each rope, each seam, each plank required vigilance. The smallest misalignment could lead to imbalance, a minor spill, or loss of speed. Sailors moved in harmony with these subtleties, adjusting weight, repositioning sails, and coordinating movements with gentle precision. Life at sea became a sequence of deliberate actions, each reinforcing skill, attention, and trust in both vessel and wind. The horizon stretched endlessly, a pale line where sky met water. Its seeming permanence contrasted with the ever-shifting surface beneath. Sailors learned to interpret its subtleties, the way clouds hinted at distant land, the shimmer that suggested shallows, the patterns of waves indicating hidden reefs. Reading these signs required quiet observation, a slow accumulation of knowledge, and confidence built from repeated, careful experience. Along the journey, small signs of human presence appeared. Distant fires on shores, the outline of small villages, faint smoke from boats approaching harbor. Each sighting was noted silently, a reminder that other sailors, other communities, shared the rhythm of the sea. These interactions were cautious and deliberate, often involving brief exchanges of goods, gestures, or signals. Knowledge and resources traveled quietly alongside people, carried on the patient current of wind and tide. Extended passages allowed reflection. Hours drifted by with little other than water, wind, and sky. Sailors observed the rise and fall of waves, the subtle variations in color, and the shifting patterns of light. They contemplated distance, navigation, and the unseen forces that guided their path. This reflection reinforced understanding, patience, and trust, creating a quiet mastery that extended beyond technical skill into rhythm, intuition, and calm endurance. Encounters with islands and distant shores were deliberate and gentle. Sailors approached carefully, reading currents, tides, and wind before making landfall. Small coves and quiet harbors offered safe anchorage, opportunities for trade, and spaces to observe new environments. The expansion of horizons was measured, paced, and patient, ensuring that knowledge and safety were maintained alongside exploration. Trade winds fostered networks that stretched far beyond initial coasts. Routes connected islands, peninsulas, and hidden harbors, creating arteries of commerce, information, and influence. Sailors carried goods, ideas, and stories, passing silently through communities that had never met before. Trust and reputation became critical. Those who navigated successfully were sought after, and their expertise dictated the flow of travel and exchange. By evening, vessels floated in calm waters near distant shores. Lanterns reflected faintly on rippling surfaces, fires burned in small coves, and the rhythmic pulse of the sea remained constant. Sailors rested, tracing paths in memory, observing clouds and stars, and noting subtle changes in wind and tide. Each journey, though physically demanding, was also an immersive meditation, a practice in patience, observation, and gentle mastery. The first great expansions of maritime horizons were complete not through conquest or force, but through observation, experience, and careful attention to the rhythms of the natural world. Knowledge of wind, current, and sky allowed early maritime peoples to travel farther than ever imagined, weaving networks of connection, trade, and silent influence across the open ocean. And in these long, measured passages, the quiet foundation of enduring maritime empires took shape, carried by wind, wave, and the patient rhythm of human skill. As years and decades passed, the silent mastery of the seas became a legacy, carried in the bodies, memories, and routines of those who navigated waters long before great armies and kingdoms rose inland. The maritime empires that emerged were not remembered in chronicles of battle or conquest. Instead, their influence lingered quietly in the patterns of tides, the shaped routes of trade, and the subtle authority of knowledge passed down from sailor to sailor, generation to generation. Dawn broke slowly over calm waters. Gentle ripples reflected the pale light, and a thin mist hovered just above the surface, softening every sound, every movement. The smell of salt was constant, mingled with the lingering aroma of fires used for cooking and warmth. Sailors moved in deliberate rhythm, adjusting sails, inspecting hulls, and preparing small meals. Every motion was deliberate, patient, a reflection of the long, careful observation that had shaped their craft and culture. Trade routes, once tentative and humble, had become structured, predictable networks. Communities across coasts and islands were connected through shared understanding of tides, currents, and seasonal patterns. Goods, dried fish, woven mats, shells, and pottery traveled along these invisible highways, as did stories, observations, and subtle lessons about wind and water. Knowledge, as much as merchandise, became currency and power, quietly shaping the interactions between settlements. The sea had taught patience and humility. Sailors knew that its moods were unpredictable, yet rhythmic. A calm morning could give way to a sudden gust or rolling swell, demanding careful adjustment and observation. Every journey reinforced the lesson that mastery was never absolute. Knowledge was practical, fluid, and deeply embedded in the senses. Bodies learned to anticipate movement, eyes read subtle signs, and minds interpreted patterns over long hours and repeated practice. Vessels themselves had become living spaces. Every plank, every rope, every small cabin reflected centuries of accumulated experience. Boats were cared for with devotion, repaired meticulously, and balanced thoughtfully to accommodate both cargo and human habitation. Life aboard was measured in gentle motion, quiet observation, and repeated routines, a rhythm that echoed the pulse of the sea itself. Sailors lived and learned within these floating homes, absorbing knowledge through immersion rather than instruction. Extended voyages created subtle forms of influence. Communities relied on the guidance of experienced sailors to navigate safely, respect routes, and sustain trade. Knowledge of hidden shoals, shifting currents, and seasonal winds became authority, a quiet power recognized without coercion. Maritime mastery was felt rather than declared, reflected in the calm confidence of those who moved across water, connecting islands and coasts with the careful rhythm of skill and experience. Even at night, the sea held lessons. Stars mirrored on calm waters guided passage, and lanterns bobbed gently on floating vessels, marking quiet presence. Waves lapped against hulls with soothing consistency, reinforcing rhythm and patience. Observing the patterns of light and motion, sailors learned continuity, repetition, and trust. Experience became memory, memory became instinct, and instinct became a silent legacy carried onward. Over time, generations internalized the knowledge of the seas. Children grew up learning to read waves, anticipate winds, and balance on rocking decks. Elders taught through example, guiding young sailors without explicit instruction. Knowledge was embedded in gestures, sequences of action, and the subtle understanding of natural patterns. In this way, culture and empire were not written in stone, but embodied, flowing through movement, observation, and repetition. The influence of these maritime peoples extended far beyond individual vessels. Trade, knowledge, and silent authority shaped interactions between islands and coastal settlements. Networks were maintained not through force, but through skill, reliability, and trust. The sea itself carried the message. Those who understood its rhythm held influence over those who did not, guiding commerce, travel, and communication without a single raised sword. In reflection, the legacy of these forgotten maritime empires was not measured by territorial conquest, monuments, or grand battles. It was measured in quiet mastery, in the patient observation of wind and wave, in the rhythms of daily life aboard vessels, and in the transmission of embodied knowledge across generations. The seas were mapped not in ink but in muscle memory, intuition, and careful attention. Their power was enduring, subtle, and invisible, yet profound. Morning returned once more. Small boats floated on calm water, sails catching gentle breezes, lanterns extinguished, fires cooled. Sailors moved with quiet purpose, following paths repeated countless times. Currents shifted subtly beneath them, birds traced arcs above, and the distant land rose slowly into view. Every detail was observed, noted, and remembered, a living map of human skill and oceanic patience. And so the silent seas carried forward the legacy of those who first learned to inhabit them. Knowledge and influence flowed across waters quietly, invisibly, yet decisively. The lessons of observation, patience, and rhythm shaped generations, forming empires not through violence, but through understanding. The forgotten maritime empires endured in the pulse of waves, the sway of boats, and the measured breath of sailors who, centuries later, still moved with the quiet authority of those who first listened to the sea. In the end, the greatest power lay not in conquest, but in the patient dialogue between human and ocean, a dialogue that continues, in every wave and whisper of wind, a testament to the enduring mastery of silent seas.